There is a practice that appears in the archaeological record with such consistency across so many different cultures and time periods that researchers who study prehistoric human behavior have had to develop an entire subfield of methodology simply to document and analyze it correctly. Infant abandonment and selective neonatal death, not as aberrations, not as rare tragedies confined to desperate individuals in exceptional circumstances, but as a structured, deliberate, and in many prehistoric and ancient contexts, socially accepted response to the birth of children that a group could not or would not raise. This is not a comfortable subject. It is also not a simple one. And untangling what the evidence actually shows, what drove these decisions, how different populations approached them, and what they reveal about the societies that made them, is one of the more illuminating exercises in prehistoric anthropology available to us. Because the reality is both more understandable and considerably more complex than the instinctive modern response to this topic tends to assume. Estimates vary considerably depending on the population, the period, and the methodology used to reconstruct demographic data from skeletal and archaeological evidence. But across a broad range of ancient and prehistoric societies, researchers have identified patterns of infant mortality that cannot be fully explained by disease, accident, or nutritional failure alone. The skeletal record is revealing in this regard. Infant remains, particularly those of newborns and very young infants, appear in ancient burial sites at frequencies and in contexts that suggest something other than straightforward natural death. Some sites show a statistical excess of neonatal remains compared to what would be expected from natural infant mortality rates alone. Others show patterns of differential burial treatment, with newborns and very young infants handled in ways that differ systematically from the treatment of older children and adults, sometimes in ways that suggest deliberate separation from the community of the fully human. This is not a marginal observation confined to a handful of unusual archaeological sites. It is a pattern that has been documented across ancient Roman contexts, ancient Greek contexts, prehistoric European burial sites, and in the ethnographic records of traditional societies studied before modernization substantially altered their practices. The consistency of the pattern across cultures that had no contact with one another is itself significant. And this is where the subject becomes genuinely interesting from an anthropological perspective, because the motivations recorded in historical sources and inferred from archaeological context are not primarily about cruelty or indifference to infant life. They are, in the main, about resource constraint operating at the level of a group trying to survive in an environment where the margin between sufficiency and catastrophe was often narrow. Hunter-gatherer populations faced a specific demographic challenge that modern sedentary societies do not. A human infant is, by the standards of virtually every other primate, extraordinarily dependent for an extraordinarily long period. A newborn chimpanzee is capable of clinging to its mother independently within hours of birth. A human newborn requires years of intensive direct support before it can contribute meaningfully to its own survival. During that entire period, the infant's primary caregiver, almost universally the mother in hunter-gatherer contexts, is substantially limited in her ability to contribute to the group's subsistence activities. In a mobile foraging context, this created a direct conflict between the needs of a new infant and the survival requirements of existing children. A woman carrying and nursing one infant, while also being responsible for a toddler who could not yet keep pace with a moving group, faced a practical problem that had no clean solution. The energetic cost of nursing alone is substantial. The cost of carrying two young children across the kind of terrain and distances that mobile foraging groups regularly covered was, in many circumstances, simply prohibitive. This is not speculation. It is supported by a consistent pattern observed across multiple ethnographic studies of hunter-gatherer populations. Groups with greater seasonal mobility tend to show longer birth spacing intervals than more sedentary groups, a pattern that researchers attribute at least partly to the practical difficulties of managing closely spaced offspring in mobile subsistence economies. The birth spacing intervals observed in some hunter-gatherer populations, typically 4 years or more between surviving children, are substantially longer than what unregulated human fertility would naturally produce. Something was suppressing fertility or managing infant survival in ways that maintained these intervals. Prolonged nursing, which suppresses ovulation and reduces fertility, accounts for some of the extended spacing. Infanticide, the deliberate ending of a newborn's life, accounts for some of the rest. And in between these two mechanisms lies a range of practices that do not fit neatly into either category. Exposure, the practice of leaving a newborn in a location where it would die from the elements without direct intervention by the parents, appears consistently in both the archaeological record and in historical documentation across numerous ancient societies. It occupies an interesting psychological and moral middle ground that is worth examining carefully, because it tells us something important about how ancient and prehistoric humans thought about the moral status of newborns. In many of the societies where exposure was practiced and documented, the newborn was not treated as a fully human person with the same moral status as an older child or adult until certain social thresholds had been passed. In ancient Rome, the paterfamilias, the male head of the household, made a formal decision about whether to raise a newborn infant. If he did not lift the child from the ground, the child was not incorporated into the family and the community, and could be exposed without legal consequence. The child had not yet been socially acknowledged as a person. Versions of this threshold exist in many other societies. Among some traditional groups studied ethnographically, a child was not considered fully human until it had received a name, which might be delayed until it was clear the child would survive its early weeks. The naming ceremony was the moment of social incorporation, and a child who died before this threshold was mourned differently, buried differently, and thought about differently than a child who had crossed it. This is not callousness. It is a culturally elaborated response to the extremely high natural infant mortality of these environments, which made emotional investment in a newborn a potentially catastrophic strategy for a parent who might lose many children before raising any to adulthood. Across a wide range of ancient sources and ethnographic records, infants with visible physical abnormalities were substantially more likely to be abandoned or killed at birth than infants who appeared healthy. The Spartans are the most frequently cited example, with ancient sources describing a practice of inspecting newborns and exposing those deemed unlikely to become capable soldiers or mothers of soldiers. But this was not uniquely Spartan. It appears in Roman legal writing, in ancient Greek philosophical discussions of ideal city governance, and in ethnographic records of traditional societies across multiple continents. The reasoning behind this pattern, in contexts where reasoning is recorded, tends to be explicitly about the cost-benefit calculation of investing in the rearing of a child, likely to require substantial support and unlikely to contribute productively to the group's survival. This is not identical to modern eugenics, which involves the state systematically directing reproduction at a population level. It is, rather, family-level decision-making operating under severe resource constraints and producing outcomes that look, from a modern perspective, profoundly troubling. Sex selection also appears in the record, and its direction was not uniform across cultures. In some societies, male infanticide was more common, particularly in contexts where warfare was frequent, and male children were perceived as a drain on resources and a liability in terms of intergroup conflict. In many others, female infanticide was more common, driven by the economic logic of bride price systems, dowry requirements, or the perception that daughters represented less productive labor investment than sons. Ancient Roman writers note, in passing, the preferential abandonment of female infants as though it were unremarkable, which suggests it was common enough to have become background noise in the culture's self-description. What these varied patterns reveal is that these were not random acts of desperation. They were structured decisions made within frameworks of cultural logic that, however alien they appear from a modern standpoint, had internal coherence within the environments that produced them. And it is one that the historical record addresses with surprising directness in some periods. In ancient Rome, the practice of exposing infants in specific public locations, forum steps, rubbish heaps at city gates, the bases of certain statues, was sufficiently common that these locations became known informal adoption markets. Individuals who wanted children, whether because of infertility, the death of their own children, or the desire for additional labor or eventual inheritance, would collect exposed infants and raise them. This created a social ecosystem around infant abandonment that complicates any simple moral narrative. The abandoning parent might have made their decision under the expectation, reasonable in certain urban environments, that the child would be collected and raised by someone else. The collecting adult acquired a child through a process that was socially acknowledged and legally managed, however informally. The child's outcome depended on an informal network of supply and demand that operated in parallel to formal family formation. The same patterns appear in other well-documented ancient societies. Ancient Mesopotamian records describe systems for the management of abandoned children in temple complexes. Medieval European documentation records ongoing debate among church authorities about how to handle the children left at monastery and convent doors, a debate that produced the institutional innovation of the foundling wheel, a rotating device set into convent walls that allowed a parent to deposit an infant anonymously and then ring a bell to alert the nuns inside, in a manner designed to make the transaction unobservable and therefore legally and morally ambiguous for the depositing parent. These institutional responses are significant precisely because they reveal that infant abandonment in these societies was not rare enough to be handled on a case-by-case basis. It was common enough to require organized infrastructure, and it is one that the historical record addresses with surprising directness in some periods. In ancient Rome, the practice of exposing infants in specific public locations, forum steps, rubbish heaps at city gates, the bases of certain statues, was sufficiently common that these locations became known informal adoption markets. Individuals who wanted children, whether because of infertility, the death of their own children, or the desire for additional labor or eventual inheritance, would collect exposed infants and raise them. This created a social ecosystem around infant abandonment that complicates any simple moral narrative. The abandoning parent might have made their decision under the expectation, reasonable in certain urban environments, that the child would be collected and raised by someone else. The collecting adult acquired a child through a process that was socially acknowledged and legally managed, however informally. The child's outcome depended on an informal network of supply and demand that operated in parallel to formal family formation. The same patterns appear in other well-documented ancient societies. Ancient Mesopotamian records describe systems for the management of abandoned children in temple complexes. Medieval European documentation records ongoing debate among church authorities about how to handle the children left at monastery and convent doors, a debate that produced the institutional innovation of the foundling wheel, a rotating device set into convent walls that allowed a parent to deposit an infant anonymously and then ring a bell to alert the nuns inside, in a manner designed to make the transaction unobservable and therefore legally and morally ambiguous for the depositing parent. These institutional responses are significant precisely because they reveal that infant abandonment in these societies was not rare enough to be handled on a case-by-case basis. It was common enough to require organized infrastructure. There is another dimension to this subject that rarely receives adequate attention, which is the experience and agency of the women at the center of these decisions. The historical and archaeological record is largely constructed from the perspective of male legal writers, male philosophers, and male archaeologists interpreting physical evidence in contexts shaped by predominantly male scholarly assumptions. The internal experience of the women who made or were compelled into these decisions is almost entirely absent from the record. What can be inferred is that these decisions were not uniformly voluntary in any modern sense of that word. In societies where the formal decision-making authority rested with a male household head, a woman's ability to influence the outcome for her own infant was constrained by structures she had no role in creating. At the same time, there is evidence in some ethnographic contexts that women exercised considerable informal influence over these decisions, and that in certain circumstances the formal authority nominally held by a male head of household was in practice shaped substantially by the preferences of the mother. There is also evidence, in both ancient literary sources and in the later medieval record, of women going to considerable lengths to conceal births and manage their outcomes outside the formal frameworks available to them. The demographic consequences of these informal practices are difficult to quantify, but almost certainly substantial. What the record does suggest, consistently, is that the emotional experience of these situations was not uncomplicated for the individuals involved, even in societies where the practice was culturally normalized. Ancient literary sources that address the subject, however briefly, often acknowledge grief. Ethnographic accounts from traditional societies describe ritualized mourning practices associated with infant death that suggest emotional loss was real even. when the death was not entirely unexpected or involuntary. Christianity played a significant role in reshaping the moral framework around infant abandonment in European contexts, introducing a theological position that treated every soul, including that of a newborn, as possessing intrinsic value independent of its social usefulness or the economic circumstances of its family. This did not eliminate infant abandonment. It produced, instead, the elaborate institutional infrastructure of the foundling hospital system, which persisted in various forms across Europe well into the modern period. The foundling hospitals of early modern Europe. From London's Foundling Hospital established in the 18th century to the older Italian Ospedali degli Innocenti dating to the Renaissance, represent an acknowledgement that infant abandonment was not a problem that moral condemnation alone could solve. They represent societies attempting to manage the gap between the idealized moral position and the demographic reality that families in poverty continued, under sufficient economic pressure, to make the same kinds of calculations that prehistoric foragers had made under the pressure of resource scarcity. The mortality rates in early foundling hospitals were themselves catastrophic. Institutions in 18th century France reported infant mortality rates of 70 to 90% among admitted foundlings in some periods, a figure that raises significant questions about whether institutional care represented a genuine alternative to the outcomes these children would otherwise have faced, or whether it primarily functioned as a socially legitimized mechanism for producing the same demographic outcome while distributing the moral responsibility more diffusely across institutional structures. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It is, however, a historically honest one. The practice of selectively not raising newborns was not the product of ancient humans who valued children less than we do, or who lacked the capacity for the kind of parental attachment that modern people experience. The ethnographic and archaeological evidence for deep parental investment in surviving children is overwhelming. Prehistoric burial sites consistently show that children who survived past infancy were mourned with care and ceremony. The grief recorded in ancient literary sources for children who died in later childhood is recognizable across 2,000 years of cultural distance. What these societies lacked was not the emotional capacity for parental love. What they lacked was the material infrastructure, the food security, the medical knowledge, the transportation technology, the institutional support structures that would have made it possible for every birth to result in a raised child without catastrophic consequences for the family, the group, or both. The decisions made at the boundaries of birth in these societies were made by people operating under constraints that have largely been dissolved by the accumulation of material progress over the past 2 centuries. The dissolution of those constraints is the actual story of what changed. Not human nature, not human capacity for love or moral concern, but the specific set of circumstances under which human beings had to make decisions about how many lives they could sustain. This is both a more accurate and a more instructive conclusion than the simple narrative of ancient barbarism it replaces. It shifts the question from what was wrong with ancient people to what were the conditions that produced these outcomes, and what changed those conditions. And those are considerably more useful questions for understanding both the past and the fragility of the present.